Hello, everyone, and welcome to End of Life University podcast, where we share real talk about life and death. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt, and this is episode number 272. Today, I'll be sharing with you an interview I did with David Roland, who is the author of a book titled The Power of Suffering, and we'll get to that interview in just a few moments. But before we do, I have a few announcements and a couple of things to talk about. For one thing, if you're new to this podcast, I wanted to let you know you can actually listen to all of the previous episodes, all 271 previous episodes, by going to the show notes webpage, which you can find at eolupodcast.com. And some of you who are longtime listeners might need that reminder as well. So you can go back and look at all the show notes from other episodes in the past and decide what you might be interested in listening to. Also, I wanted to let you know that the audiobook for my new book, The Journey from Ego to Soul, How to Transform Your Life When Everything Falls Apart, is now being sold on several different platforms. It's not available yet on Amazon's Audible platform, but that should be coming in the next couple of weeks. They're just a little bit slower at getting it going, but there are several other platforms where you can buy the audiobook, and I will leave links to those in the show notes for this episode, again at eolupodcast.com. And just to mention one more time, this book, The Journey from Ego to Soul, is a companion book. It's kind of a sequel to my book, 7 Lessons for Living from the Dying. That first book explains how I learned important spiritual lessons by working with hospice patients at the end of life. And in The Journey from Ego to Soul, I dive into the process by which I actually put those lessons to work in my own life and how I learned to embody them through the work that I was doing. So it's really the next step in spiritual growth and transformation as we wake up to the presence of our own egos and begin to understand how ego sabotages sometimes and undermines the work we're trying to do, and why what we really need is a higher perspective or a connection with our own souls in order to become who we are meant to be. So that's a little bit of what this book, The Journey from Ego to Soul, is about. And again, there'll be links. You can get it as a print book, ebook, and now an audiobook. You'll find all that in the show notes. And on November 12th, I'm offering a bonus workshop for anyone who purchases the book called Finding Grace in Times of Suffering. And so this workshop will really focus in on some simple, brief practices that we can do on a daily basis right now, particularly because we're going through a lot of challenges and difficulties in our world and will be for many months ahead, I believe. So these are practices you can use in the moment to help you stay on balance and kind of stay in your higher state of awareness, and to help you get through these challenging times. And that's part of what I'm going to teach in this bonus workshop. So the workshop is November 12th, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. There will be a link where you can sign up for that workshop. If you've purchased the book, you just enter the receipt number to indicate that you have the book, and you'll be able to sign up for the workshop. So I hope you'll join me there, because it should be a really valuable time together. And then one more announcement to tell you about. There is an online one-day conference called Mortality, Life and Death During a Pandemic, which is a fundraiser for Lily House. This is going on between 10 a.m. and 3:30 p.m. on November 14th. I'll also leave a link in the show notes so that you can sign up if you'd like to take part in this fundraiser event, and I'll be speaking. So that's why I'm telling you about it. I'll be one of the speakers there, and I'm really looking forward to that and excited about it. So a couple of opportunities coming up where you can connect with me and with other people if you'd like. And one final thing I just wanted to mention, if you're a regular listener to the podcast, you may know that I had been doing a vigil recording once a month on the 9th of the month during the entire time we've been dealing with this pandemic. However, in the month of October, I didn't get a vigil recorded. I was busy getting ready to travel and I just really didn't have time to do it. So I skipped it. I didn't mention it at all. I just didn't do it and didn't make it available. And I honestly thought maybe no one even listens to those because no one said anything about it until a couple of days ago. I got an email from Eileen who asked if there would be more vigils and let me know that she really enjoys listening to them and also how much she enjoys the other content I put out. And I just have to say how encouraging it was for me to hear that. And I've told you this before, that sometimes as a content creator, I sit by myself in this room. I record these podcasts and vigils. I recorded a whole audiobook all by myself, all alone. And I put things out into the world. And I honestly don't know if anyone listens, who listens, how many people listen. I really don't know. Even around the vigils, I thought, I don't get any feedback about these. So maybe no one actually listens, and maybe I'm putting time and effort into something that doesn't matter and isn't really of value. So I just wanted to say thank you, Eileen, for your kind words and for inspiring me to get busy and keep creating those vigils each month on the 9th of the month. So the day this podcast is airing is the 9th of this month. So there will be a new vigil out today as this is broadcast. And I will do my absolute best to keep those coming every month as long as needed. So now we'll move on to the interview for today with David Roland. And I hope you enjoy it. I really had a great time talking with David. We're kind of kindred spirits, as you'll see when you listen. So as always, stay tuned after this interview. I'll come back with a few takeaways and to say goodbye. So here we go. Today, I have a very special guest on the podcast, Dr. David Roland. David is a clinical psychologist, writer, and presenter who draws on his lived experience as well as his professional training in his writing and work. He's the author of The Power of Suffering, Growing Through Life Crises, which draws together the real-life stories of 11 incredible people who survived their crises and grew in transformative ways. He's also written the memoir, How I Rescued My Brain, a psychologist's remarkable recovery from stroke and trauma. David is published in Best Australian Science Writing 2015. He's been featured in the Sunday Express, the Independent, the Sydney Morning Herald, Huffington Post, The Conversation, Wellbeing on ABC Television and ABC Radio, and podcasts worldwide. In 2015, he was awarded the Stroke Foundation's Creative Award, which is also impressive. And he's coming to us from Byron Bay, Australia. So we're halfway around the world from each other. And it's Saturday morning there and Friday evening here. So if you want to learn more about David's books and his work, you can go to his website, which is davidroland.com.au. So David, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Good evening, Karen. And it's actually a lovely morning here for me.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. And it's interesting, isn't it, that how easily we're able to connect around the world. Like, these are remarkable times.
Yes, and I think, that of course there's some silver linings in everything that's been happening. And for me, one of the silver linings has been with this book release, all my public events, face-to-face events were cancelled. But what's happened is that I've created or connected with a much more international community such as yourself. I don't think we would have been speaking if, what has happened hadn't happened.
It's so true. And I've been finding I've attended so many events that I never would have been part of had I had to travel there physically.
Yes.
in order to participate. And so I think we're just opening our minds to a new way of connecting that at least it's keeping us together and keeping us networked for now.
Yes, and maybe, the upside is that we're sharing ideas more easily and more widely throughout the global community.
Yes, so true. And That, I'm so excited to have a chance to talk to you because your new book, The Power of Suffering, really appeals to me. And right now it's amazing that it came out this year in 2020, because I really think as a global community, that's what we're dealing with on a daily basis, is how do we navigate the suffering that we're encountering. And that's a topic I'm really passionate about. So I'm so glad that you're here to discuss it.
Yes, yes, and I think the subject of your book as well and mine. I think what's interesting is that we're coming from completely different perspectives, but ending up in a similar meeting place from what I know of your work. And I would say the other thing that's happening with this global pandemic is not only the suffering, which is huge and not to be underestimated, but the other thing we're realizing is that life's uncertain. And life has always been uncertain. It's just that because it's happening to so many people at the same time, it's a subject we can easily talk about. But if you have a death of a loved one before their time, or you have a car accident, you know that life's uncertain. That anything could happen at any time. But it's sort of been like a big self-help group, a global self-help group, because everybody's experiencing the uncertainty and disruption at the same time, and makes it much easier to talk about it.
Yes, it's so interesting because in the past, people have told me when they were experiencing grief, they felt so isolated and alone because no one they knew was also going through grief. But that's not true anymore. Now there's we're all in many ways going through our own grief process through this pandemic, and as we look at what's happening around us in the world. And so in some ways, though, we're physically isolated more in our homes,
Yes,
but
yes.
we're also connected more emotionally, I think, through the suffering and through the grief.
Mm. And you probably have experienced this, and I certainly have, that when you have conversations with somebody else who's been through intense suffering and they've come out of that suffering, and I've been through suffering and come out of that suffering, you can have a quality of conversation that you never would have had before. And it is something very authentic and very real about these conversations, these deeper conversations. And for me, it just becomes joyful to have these conversations and this deeper connection.
Mm, so true, so true. I've experienced that over and over again in my work, as you said, and it's it's actually reassuring in many ways to have that knowledge. But then, as you and I look out at the rest of the world, we recognize so many people don't have not experienced that yet. They haven't gotten through
Mm,
the suffering yet to know that there is joy within it. And so
yeah,
I think that's why your book is so very important to get that
mm,
message out to people right now.
yes, yeah, I agree.
Well, would you start by just tell us all a little bit more about your personal story and how you ended up writing about suffering?
Yeah, for sure. I knew quite early on when I was a teenager that I was really interested in human psychology, and I went to university with that in mind. And the first job I got after graduating was actually working in the prison system, not because I wanted to work in the prison system, but just because that was the first job that came along for a new graduate with no experience. And in that prison system, I met my first murderers, my first pedophiles, my first rapists, my first heroin addicts, my first everything pretty much, coming from a white, middle class, well educated background. It was initially shocking for me and certainly eye opening. And one of the lessons I gained from that, as I adjusted to and heard the stories of the inmates that I would deal with, is that if I had been through their life stories, if I'd been in their backgrounds, would I have ended up in the prison system myself? Was there something inherently good about me or inherently bad about them? And in most instances, I thought, No, we're pretty much the same, but our backgrounds and upbringing and so on does have a huge influence on how we end up in life. However, I did meet, my first psychopaths as well. And I would say, and in The Power of Suffering, I talk about a particular case that I came across that really shook me to my core. I thought, this is evil. If evil is a word and you can see evil, these guys and what they'd done was evil. And that was a very shocking thing, too, to think that there's people who exist who cannot or seemingly cannot have any empathy for another human being suffering and will do, the most brutal things. So I've got to say that when 20 years later on, when I was running my own private practice and I was now very experienced in doing clinical and forensic work, I suffered post-traumatic stress disorder because all the 20 plus years of stories that I'd heard, which went right back to the early times that I'd worked in the prison system, caught up with me. And it was one day I was working with a woman doing an assessment for her legal case, I think it was. And she told me she was an adult survivor of ongoing sexual abuse and physical abuse and parental neglect. And I thought, your story is so awful. I actually don't want to hear it. And as a health professional, when you don't want to hear somebody's story or it's impacting you so much that you don't want to hear it, you actually want to walk out of the room. I wanted to tell her to stop, but but my professional ethics said, no, you've agreed to do this assessment and write the report for her. She's been let down so many times, you can't let her down. But it was after doing that case that I thought, I think I'm being affected by my actual work. And I went and saw a more senior clinical psychologist who I knew worked in the trauma area. And I said, I think work's really affected me. And I'm wondering if I've become traumatized. And, he did all the good things that a psychologist would do in assessing. And he said, I think you've got post traumatic stress disorder and you're also depressed. And that actually made a lot of sense. I was having nightmares. Had 3 young daughters, and I was imagining them in horrible situations. And I decided to take some time off my private practice and underwent some psychotherapy with him. His name is Wayne, thinking I'd be back after 6 months. But 6 months came and went, and it was clear that I couldn't get back to work. So I continued on. And then this is around 2008. When the global financial crisis hit. And we were badly affected by that because I hadn't been able to earn income for almost 2 years by that point, and my wife's business suffered pretty much like what's happening now for a lot of people. And we were incredibly stressed because of the financial pressures. And then I had a stroke out of the blue, and my physician who was looking after me at that time said, I think stress was the cause of your stroke. He said, medically speaking, I can't stand up in court and say that, but you've got no other medical risk factors that would have suggested that you got a stroke. Now, I had what they call a walk and talk stroke where I didn't lose mobility, I didn't get the droopiness, but I lost a quarter of my visual field and I lost a fair bit of my auditory processing. So having conversations like this would have been impossible for me. I would have already forgotten what you asked me. I would have forgotten what I was trying to say, and I would be incredibly fatigued. So in those days, at least anyway, there was no treatment, no rehab. There was physical rehab if you couldn't use your arm or a leg. But, for the cognitive impairments I had, there was no rehab. So I then actually, after I sort of took in what had happened, I thought, well, I've got to find something to do. Surely there's something I can do to speed up my recovery. And that's when I set about working out my own rehabilitation plan. And that's pretty much the subject of my memoir, How I Rescued My Brain. So I don't know if you want me to stop there, Karen.
Oh, I'm just so fascinated to hear about the post-traumatic stress disorder from working with some of the people and listening to the stories, because I think that that actually happens to a lot of people in helping professions who are
Mm.
around a lot of trauma and suffering, but it may go unrecognized quite often.
Yes, I think that's certainly the case, and you've probably heard the term compassion fatigue to describe that. I've come to the view that empathy and compassion are actually two different mind states, and that what I was doing was being empathic. So I was putting myself in my patient's or my client's shoes to feel what they were feeling. So like with that sexual abuse victim I was describing, I was back there in the room with her as a child when she was about to be beaten, and I was the fly on the wall, and I was feeling what she was feeling, or some aspect of that. And I don't know if you've read Dan Siegel's book, Mindsight, but when I read that book, that was one of the starts where I thought, okay, that's how, if I'm working with somebody and they're describing their story and their experience, the way I register what the feeling is that physiologically I experience that in my body, and I say, oh, okay, that's sadness. Oh, okay, that's anger. So every time we're with somebody, when we're in that empathic state, we are recreating that experience in ourselves, and we're doing that day in, day out. And surely that's going to have a build-up effect, which is what I think happened. But then I discovered that compassion is a different mind state. Would you like me to talk about that?
Yes, please, let's do.
Okay, so I got well from my PTSD and I got well from my stroke. And it happened to be that a colleague of mine, through some interesting connection, we found out that a very renowned neuroscientist, Tanya Singer from a research institute in Germany, was visiting our area. And he organized for her to come and meet with us in my friend's lounge room with another couple of mental health colleagues. And she gave us a mini seminar. And what she described was that neurologically speaking, as in brain activity, there are different neural circuits operating when we're empathic and when we're compassionate. And she said she first came across this when she was doing research with Mateo Ricard, who's the Tibetan Buddhist speaker and writer, and was once a colleague of the Dalai Lama, but also was once a French scientist. She put him through her functional MRI machine, and she said, "I want you to, feel the suffering of all the world. I want to see what's happening in your brain." So he went into the MRI machine and did that, and came out. And she said, "Well, how was that?" And he said, "Oh, I feel terrible. I've been experiencing all the suffering in the world, and it's awful." And she was surprised. And he said, "Do you mind if I do my normal meditation where I offer compassion to all the suffering in the world?" And she said, "Sure. Well, why don't you do it in the machine and we'll see what that's like?" And he went back into the machine and did his compassion for everything, suffering for everyone. And he came out and he said, "Oh, I feel so much better." It's like, you've had a shower and you've suddenly got all the dirt off you. And she said, what was remarkable is that different neural circuits in your brain were active when you were doing the compassion focused meditation. And when she explained that really made a lot of sense to me, because I've been doing some loving kindness meditation as part of my recovery. And I was noticing that I would get into this compassionate frame of mind, even for difficult people, and I wouldn't feel pulled down by it. And I could even be with people that were experiencing some suffering, and I could still feel their suffering, and I was, still able to be sensitive to their suffering, but I wasn't being pulled down by it. And Tanya Singer has then, done more research with people that are not trained meditators, and told them to do an empathy practice and then a compassionate practice while watching distressing material, and once again found the same thing, that those that are in more compassionate mindset can handle the distress of others, can still feel they want to help them, but not pulled down by it.
That is fascinating. And this is really important information, I think, for everyone listening in right now, because of again of what we're going through as a global society.
Mm,
I think a lot of us are reading the stories of other people and hearing what's going on in various places, and maybe we are feeling emotionally overwhelmed and exhausted because we're experiencing empathy when what we need to be practicing is compassion.
mm, mm. This might be a good point to talk a bit about Paul Gilbert's work and compassion focused therapy. I'm thinking.
Yes, yes.
Um, Paul Gilbert is a professor of psychology in the UK who I've met several times. He's the founder of compassion focused therapy, which is the formalized way of describing how to apply compassion focused practices to oneself, so a form of self compassion. And what's worth explaining here is that he has an evolutionary view of the human brain. So he talks about three different circuits or three different modalities within our brain that determines our behavior. And the first one, of course, is the drive system, which is about seeking food and shelter and sex and just making sure we survive, get the things that we need to survive. But it's also the system that's operating, when we go for goals and we have achievement, we get a dopamine hit, we get a high from achieving things. And the threat system, which of course we're all familiar with, is the one that keeps us safe. So if there's a perceived threat, we'll get the fight flight response. And, that's such an ancient system that it happens automatically. And of course, part of managing anxiety is sometimes turning that off because it's going off when there's actually no real threat. But the third system, which has evolved in mammals, is the caregiving system. And in humans in particular, it's highly evolved because we have such dependent young when they're born. So parents need to invest a lot of energy and time in raising a human child. They might, when we think about most mammals, the young are capable of doing what they need to do often quite soon after birth. So to ensure that humans look after their young, this caregiving system has become really heightened. And it's evolved into a caregiving system and also an affiliative system, the system that wants us to connect socially with each other. And that's another feature of human beings, is that we're the most highly social animals on the planet. And that's one of the reasons for our success. So when someone dies, for example, that we're close to, we feel grief, immense grief, because we've developed this emotional attachment to them. If I was a reptile and, my reptile buddy died, I probably wouldn't think very much about it. I wouldn't be experiencing immense grief anyway, because, attachments aren't important for reptiles. So, the plus side is that we can feel love, we can feel compassion, but we can also feel hurt and grief and loss. So what the compassion focused therapy does is try and activate this self-caring or self-compassionate affiliative system. So in times of great distress, we want to turn off the drive system. We want to turn off the threat system and cultivate this more caregiving affiliative system. And one of the big ways we do that is by connecting with others and sharing our stories, sharing what's going on for me. So somebody might be listening to us talking about these issues and they might think, oh, here's somebody that understands what I'm feeling. And that would help to self-soothe, help to activate their caregiving affiliative system.
And this gives me a clue why your book, The Power of Suffering, is so important, because you have shared in depth the stories of these 11 people that you spent a great deal of time with. in and their suffering and what they've experienced. So it seems to me that even reading the stories of other people could be soothing in that way also.
Yes, I definitely think so. And, when I was approaching this book, I really wanted to have as its basis lived experience. I wanted real stories, real experiences, and then overlay that with the research on things like compassion and post traumatic growth, rather than do a top down approach, which an academic might do, because I wanted the stories to really sound real and be resonate. And I know in my recovery, I just ached for stories of other people going through hard times, coming out of it, and finding a new form of success. And it didn't matter to me whether those stories were in a movie based on true events, whether it was in a book, or as somebody telling their story on a podcast. It didn't matter, and it didn't matter necessarily whether the story echoed exactly the sorts of details that I'd been through, like a neurological incident.
Yes, and I love that the common thread through the stories that you share in the book is this idea of growth after trauma and after suffering. And so I was wondering if you talk a little bit more about post-traumatic growth, because I think that for me, there's so much hope in that term alone, post-traumatic growth. And I feel like that's something we all need to hear right now.
Yes, yes. And, the book, The Power of Suffering, is a hopeful book. And that's always how I wanted it to be. And when I started my investigation and I connected with various people, I just wanted a range of stories. I didn't know these people when I started out. So I was actually unsure, how much hope these stories would offer when I began. But sure enough, there it was. So it feels to me that when we're in the middle of a crisis, we're just trying to survive. Sometimes it's really just surviving the day, one day at a time, or even sometimes hour by hour. And it's hard in those in that early phase of survival to think, how am I going to get through this? And sometimes what we need to know is just that there's hope, that other people have done it, so therefore I can. And in the early stages, if it's a single event like a car accident, or you've been given a diagnosis of a life-threatening illness and it's looking pretty bad, there's often shock and disbelief. It takes a while before acceptance comes. Once acceptance comes, this is the start of the growth journey. Now, acceptance here is just saying, okay, this is how it is now. So I've had this loss, or I've got this disability, whatever it is, this is how it is now. What can I make of that? So we've gone from, that reactive, intrusive thinking, just going over and over what's happened, to a more proactive type of thinking. More, okay, what can I make out of this? What would help? Who should I connect with? What can I learn about? In my case, when I was coming out of my trauma and my stroke, I'd kept a daily journal, and I had all this writing that went through a number of years. And I started to think, maybe I can tell my story, or as in writing a book, and that would help other people. So I didn't know what I did. So I went and saw a writing mentor, who a published author, and I told him, and I said, do you think I've got a book? He said, yes, I think you do. I said, well, what do you need to do? And I said, what do I need to do? And he said, well, start writing stories. And then I did some writing courses, and then I joined a writers group, and then I pitched my story idea at a writers festival, and publishers are interested. So that was all, more proactive thinking. And that's the type of thinking that will start to lead us to growth. And there's a whole area of research, post-traumatic growth, which has validated that across all types of traumas, across all types of cultures, more often than not, people will grow in particular ways as a result of their trauma. And trauma is used in the broad sense here to mean any sort of major life upheaval. And we can talk a bit more about that if you like, Karen.
Yes, because I was really interested in that in the book, the domains of growth that can occur, and why not everyone experiences the same types of growth. But yeah, I'd love to learn more about that.
Well, I think the first one, which is really common, is that people develop personal courage. And, if people are listening to this, I'd ask them to reflect on their life and think about any time in their life that they've been through some struggle. It doesn't have to be a traumatic one. It might be, learning something at school that was really difficult, or learning a skill and actually sticking at it and then getting through it and thinking, well, I did that. Before I started, I didn't think I could do that, but I did it, even if it's jumping out of an airplane, with a parachute. Um, so quite commonly, people will say, I don't know how I got through that, but I look back and I think, you did pretty darn good. If I can get through that, what can't I get through? And so this sense of personal courage enlivens you, strengthens you, actually adds to your skill set of resilience, if you like, because it makes you realize that you're stronger than you thought you were, and that if any other life crisis should befall you, you'll find a way through that. It doesn't mean that it will be easy, but you'll find a way through that. So, personal courage is a very common outcome. Another common outcome is this idea that, life is precious, life is fragile, and developing great gratitude for what you have. So, my experience was that. I actually started to become disinterested in expensive, elaborate sort of amusements or activities, and actually really enjoyed just much more simple pleasures. A walk on the beach, having coffee with a friend, just hanging out, having good conversations, going camping with my daughters. And I actually found that there was more joy in those simple pleasures. And another area in which people grow is just they develop much deeper connections with people. So they start to value or reprioritize their relationships. So that could mean that sometimes you let go of some relationships because you see that they're not helpful, or they're not aligned with your new life purpose and meaning. So you become a bit clearer about your life purpose and meaning. And I think they're actually two different things. And you align people that fit with that. And my experience was that I actually, to recover, I actually had to reach out to a lot of people, which was uncomfortable for me. But now I find that much easier. If I need help, I do that much more readily. So that's actually a strength. Uh, you know, reaching out is one of the acts of resilience. Because people that think they're just going to do it on their own are really up against it, and they're really limiting their chances. Another area that people grow in often is spirituality in the broadest sense. And I think people that have got religious values or religious beliefs, when they're going through major life upheavals, have already got an advantage. They've got an advantage because they're thinking, beyond themselves. If they have a belief in God, they feel that there's, God or this other being is assisting them in some way. And often they'll have a community around their religious beliefs, which becomes supportive as well. Um, but there's many people that don't have a set religion, but they grow in spiritual ways. So they start to become less egoistic. They start to see beyond the everyday. They start to seek out awe experiences, whether that's through nature or it's through the arts. And I like to put it simply by saying, you decrease the I, the sense of I, and grow the sense of we. And often what happens is that people want to give back. So they become much more sensitive to the suffering of others, humans and animals, and the world itself. And they want to do things to, reduce that suffering. And that's what I call compassion. So compassion for me is sensitivity to the suffering of others and wanting to alleviate that suffering in a wise way.
Mm, this is so beautiful. I was just thinking as you were speaking that these are actually some of the changes that I observed in hospice patients as they were nearing the end of life. I saw the dying process itself can be very transformative for people. And I saw some of these very same changes happening. Yet those patients, most of them said to me, I wish I had known this earlier in life, because they're experiencing this transformation and growth and recognizing they only have a short time left to be here and enjoy that growth that they've gone through. And so it's so powerful to see that kind of transformation happens after we go through intense suffering.
Mm. And would you say then, Karen, that you would describe that growth as wisdom?
Yes, I would. That at least
Mm.
that's how it feels to me, or comes across to me, that it is a certain wisdom or higher wisdom about life.
Mm. Yeah, because I think it's a word that I don't use loosely, but I actually like it. And I think it does apply in these situations, that people have gone through the crucible, they've gone through the fire, and they come out of it and say, I think I've got a better understanding of what's important in life or what's important to me. And I want to act on that with whatever time I've got left. And if people are saying, I wish I'd known that before, then they're saying, well, I've wised up, and I wish I'd had that wisdom, earlier on. Just like, when we're older, we think, I wish I had the body of a 20-year-old, but with the wisdom that I've got now.
Yes. Well, it's interesting to me because from reading your book, I gather, and I experience this with dying patients as well, not everyone does experience growth after trauma. And so, I'm curious about that. What are some of the factors why some people seem to get stuck and don't seem to experience the growth?
Yes, and that's exactly right. And not everybody experiences growth. And I was totally fascinated by why that was. And in the book, as you'll know, there's a chapter where I've interviewed or spent time with three different health professionals who have their own story of trauma and growth. But I particularly wanted to talk to them about why, in their experience, professional experience, that some people didn't grow. And I think there's no one factor, it's a combination of things. But if there was one major factor, I would say it is when people don't reach out to others. So there's the story of Dr. Rob Gordon, the psychologist who's specializes in natural disasters, and he was telling me how he was giving an example of two people who both had in this case they'd had gunshot wounds, just accidental gunshot wounds, and one of them had this strong belief that they both were religious, actually, and one of them said, "Oh, I've survived this accident, so God must want me to find some meaning in this, and some new plan." So he saw that as an awakening. Whereas the woman who'd had the wound, it turned out to actually be a minor wound. She said, "I can't believe why God would do this to me. I've been going to church every Sunday. I'm a good Christian. Why would He do this to me?" And so she just could not have, her belief system was not flexible enough to see it in any other way than God was being vengeful towards us. So people that have got very rigid thinking patterns, rigid beliefs, are really going to find it hard to change. But the bigger the impact of the event, the more likely it's going to shatter our belief system. So, so that's one way of saying that people who've got more rigid belief systems are going to find it harder to change. They're more likely to stay stuck in their suffering. But the other thing that Rob Gordon said was that, in Australia, as you know, as you've had, we have major wildfires, and he was working with people in the aftermath of those, And he says the research is that those who've done best after the fires, and we're talking about, regional communities, are those that join self-help groups. So those that join with others. And in general, the more groups that they do, the better they survive. There was one thing that would predict somebody's coming through the trauma and growing from it. It was joining self-help groups, as long as they didn't do too many, like they were just too busy going to all these groups. The other things that can affect, we've got to remember there's other reasons why people find it difficult to grow through their suffering. If you're in a life situation where there's actually nobody else really you can connect with, and I've worked in the prison system, and it's actually quite dangerous to express your vulnerability in a prison system. So in that environment, it's very difficult to find somebody you can reach out to that's trustworthy and safe. But it might be also, there might be socioeconomic situations where there's just so many other things going on, so many other pressures, that it's just one thing too many, and you've got to sort out the other things before you can sort out this new trauma. We need helping professionals, we need self-help groups. If you don't have access to those, that's going to be difficult. There's also personality characteristics. So generally people that are more curious, they're more likely to, ask questions. So, if you're a patient and the doctor says, well, this is your diagnosis, this is the treatment, see you later, some people will just accept that and go off and do that. And this is no comment on, the professionalism and the expertise of doctors, but somebody, and I would be one of those people, would say, okay, is it worth me getting a second opinion? Or, where can I find out more information about this? Or is there somebody else I can talk to? So those people that will ask questions and are curious are going to be more open to new possibilities and new ways of thinking about things and new ways of behaving in response to life events.
This is so fascinating, and I'm just getting so many insights actually into myself because in my own personal story, my father died by suicide many years ago now, but looking back, I see that I was really stuck in my grief for a number of years, and I understood even then part of the reason why is that I didn't know if it was okay for me to grow from the experience, because somehow that created cognitive dissonance for me, that if my father died by suicide so that I could grow, does that make sense? And feeling like then am I responsible for his death because I needed him to die so that I could grow? And anyway, I went around and around with those thoughts, and I actually resisted growing because I couldn't quite make sense of it. I felt confused about it. And it took a few years for me to get past that, to realize that growing through this would actually be the best way I could possibly honor my dad's death, to actually become a better person and to allow myself to grow. But this is giving me some insight into why that may have happened and why I temporarily got stuck there.
Yes, you had those fixed beliefs about, well, first of all, you couldn't open up to the idea that there could be a benefit in your father's death for you.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's a very challenging view to take, isn't it? After a suicide.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it took me quite a while to come to terms with that.
And I might just add a comment there, Karen, because the other thing we want to be mindful of, it's easy for me to say, okay, you have this event, there's shock and disbelief, and then you get acceptance, and then you start to grow. We could be talking about years for this process.
True.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily a quick thing.
Yeah, and I suppose in some ways, in the beginning, being stuck, if we want to call it that, is part of the process, part of the normal process people go through.
Yeah. Yeah, there's that churning, isn't a feeling of churning through these ideas and still trying to make sense of what's happened. and so what now, and how am I supposed to be given what's happened. And the death of a loved one, and in my clinical experience, the death of a child and a suicide are the two most difficult things for those who are left to find acceptance and to move on in a positive way. They're the two most difficult things.
Yes. Yes, I can see that. Well, one thing that I know you already alluded to the fact that you yourself use the loving kindness meditation,
Mm-hmm.
and your book talks about some practices that you recommend. And I think that's really important for all of us right now, too, to realize there are things we can do in our daily lives to build up our resilience. And so, would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I think one thing that was even very valuable when I was still in that survival period was finding moments of joy in each day. And it may seem like when you're in the darkness of the survival period that there's no joy to be found. And maybe there is no, like, whoop, jumping up and down type joy, but there will be moments of joy. There'll be moments when the pain or the suffering is less, or there's moments where you don't feel the pain or the suffering. And that, for me, one of the things I used to do was I would always do something in the day that felt enjoyable. And commonly that would be I was able to walk to a local cafe from our home, and that would be taking the newspaper, having a coffee, and sitting out on one of the tables watching the world go by, and just by myself. It always had to be by myself, so no one would interrupt me, nobody demanded anything of me, and that was my time. And that might be half an hour, whatever I had. And the other thing that I used to do was go swimming in the ocean, because I live near the ocean. I've always loved swimming, and after the stroke, I couldn't get straight back to swimming. But once I could, swim in the ocean, sort of often cleansed me of, for a while, of all the negativity and the worries. So, is there an activity or a thing that you can do? And being in nature, music, arts, connecting with a particular person, gardening, whatever it might be, is there one thing that you can do each day at least that will give you a sense of enjoyment or even joy? And you can cultivate that. I guess the other thing is, we were talking about the compassion focused therapy and the activating this caregiving affiliative system. And we've already touched on how sharing our experiences with others is a way of self-soothing. Being understood by somebody else or sharing their story is a way of self-soothing. So any other ways of self-soothing, that could be physical things, like putting your hand on your heart. Kristen Neff, who's a self-compassion researcher, talks about some of those things. Doing mental, meditations, guided meditations, which take you through a meditation where you're actually activating that caregiving affiliative system, or the rest and digest system, and it's turning off the threat system or the drive system. So anything that would do that is going to help you survive this period. And as I said, hearing other people's stories, whether that's through reading, it's through listening, or it's through watching a movie. These are all things that will get us through a difficult period to a place where we can start to get that more, directive type of thinking that I was talking about earlier.
These are all excellent suggestions. And I know you mentioned the loving kindness meditation. Is that something that you do every day, and do you still utilize that?
I wish I would do it more often now. I meditate every day. For me, it's hard for me to start my day if I don't have a meditation. And even if I'm really running short of time, even 5 minutes, it makes a difference. It's so much a part of my day. It's almost like, brushing my teeth. I couldn't imagine starting my day without brushing my teeth. Meditation. So I'm using a breath meditation typically, where I'm just focusing on my breath and sitting still. The loving kindness meditation is, or compassion focused meditations. There's a variety of them, and I encourage people to go online and and find out some of those. And I could even send you some links, Karen, if you like,
Right.
to put in your show notes. Um, the loving kindness really starts with imagining or bringing to mind, and that can be visual and feeling, somebody that, or a thing that you really, could be an animal that you really care about, and feeling the love that that you have for them, and then bringing that love and that feeling into yourself. So applying it to a self. We start this way because it's often easier to imagine or to cultivate the love for someone else than ourselves. We find that easier. So we bring the love that we've cultivated to ourselves, and then we might imagine a friend or somebody we like, and apply that love or loving kindness to them, and then maybe just a neutral person, somebody that you might see in the street, or just you might see at the checkout, or you apply that to a neutral person, and then apply that to a difficult person. Now, when I was going through my, recovery period, and I was doing absolutely everything I could imagine to do to get well, I was meditating for up to an hour and a half a day, and I would always do the loving kindness meditation. And I have a member of my family that has been very difficult throughout my life in various ways, and I was applying that to him, and it really softened the way I felt towards him. It doesn't change his behavior, but it allows me to be more comfortable with the idea of him and when I would be with him. So this loving kindness meditation can also extend to the rest of the world. So we can imagine, our community where we live, apply that loving kindness to them. It might apply it to our country. We might apply it to the world. And it really actually makes a difference. Neurologically speaking, it's changing our brain to have this other focus rather than this, small I. It's encouraging that bigger we.
Mm. Yes, that's beautiful. It's a beautiful practice. Uh, I've done it before, the loving kindness meditation at a retreat, and it was amazing. And then I wanted to ask you too, before we get to the end, about supporting other people who are suffering. If we ourselves feel like we're doing okay, but we have someone in our lives who's really going through suffering, do you have suggestions for how we can best help them?
Yes, this is a concept I talk about in the book called the expert companion, and that's not my terminology. That's actually from Richard Tedeschi, who's one of the grandfathers of the post-traumatic growth research field. And I spent 2 days with Richard doing a workshop, and he talked about this quite a lot. It's so important. So even if you or we haven't been through some major life upheaval, or we haven't been through the type of experience that maybe our friend or loved one or work colleague is going through, what can we offer them? Now, so often we're afraid to say the right thing, afraid to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, and we might avoid them. And that really is the worst thing you can do. Now, you talked about, people feeling alone in their grief, and it's so true. When you have this life upheaval, you can feel really dissociated from the rest of the world. And what you really want is somebody just to say, I see you, I acknowledge you, I acknowledge your pain. Now, there's a story in the book about Paul, who's a senior chaplain with the ambulance service. And I learned a really good lesson from him. He said, I might go to the scene, to a family home, and there's been the death of a child. The parents are distraught. No one knows what to do. The paramedics, have said, well, we can't revive the child. He says, in a situation like that, or it could be a road accident, he says, there's nothing to be fixed. You can't go in there and fix anything. So just take that burden off yourself. So go and just be with the person. So letting go of the idea we have to fix it or make it better for them is the first thing. The second thing is to just learn what it's like for them. So say, I'm sorry. How are you, or how's it going? And just open up to learning what their experience is like. They may not actually want to talk very much, so you just sit with them. They may want to talk a lot, so you just hear it. And we don't want to bring a judgmental attitude to it, because how can we be the expert in what they're going through? They're the one going through it. So we just have this non-judgmental attitude and hear what they're saying and approach it like we're a learner here, we're a first-timer here. Of course, in any of these situations, we do anything to keep them safe or, help provide any practical needs. It might be, cooking food or just making sure practical things are done. Of course we do that, and that might be the main way you want to help out somebody. But really, they just want human presence, non-judgmental, that's just there, and you could even sit in silence. There's a story in the book of Maurice, who was blinded at age 12. Then his brother died in a shooting accident. Then his mother died young, and then his father died young. So he had all these things happen over the course of about 10 years. And he just thought, well, that's my life. It's just total tragedy, one after the other. What's the next thing that's going to happen? And he had all these people say things to him that they thought would be helpful, but none of them were. They were just being very judgmental and very opinionated, until a friend he hadn't seen in a long while came to him and said, Maurice, and she hugged him and said, you've had a tragic life.
Hmm.
And he said that was the first time somebody recognized the pain he was going through and made no judgment about how he should be or what he should be doing or, what he should be believing or saying. She just acknowledged his pain. And, when people are in distress, it's easy to, be overwhelmed by their distress. But can we just stay there, do our own breathing, just stay present centered as much as we can, and just be with them.
That's so beautiful. This is such good advice. And I think for all of us right now, as we have people in our lives who are going through varying amounts of suffering, for us to just remember being there and being present with people is sometimes the very best gift that we can give.
Mm.
Well, David, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I can't believe an hour has gone by so quickly.
I think we just started.
I know. Gosh. We have to do this again. We'll have to have part two of this discussion. Well, I wanted to be sure to let people know your book is The Power of Suffering, Growing Through Life Crises. And it's absolutely beautiful. I recommend it so highly to everyone. So tell people where they can get a hold of the book.
It's available, in all the online bookstores as an audio book and an ebook or Kindle. The print book is just about to be released in the UK, so it's certainly available in Australia. But if you're in the US, I would recommend probably Amazon UK or Book Depository if you want to get a copy of the paperback. But the audiobook is read by an accomplished Australian actor. If you like the Australian accent, there you go. He does I've listened to the audiobook and I just actually really enjoy it. And I think, Karen, we might try and run a little a giveaway, which could be an audiobook, an ebook. I've just been chatting with my publisher, see if we can offer something, so I can let you know about that.
Oh, good. Definitely. Yeah, that would be wonderful. And David's website again is davidroland.com.au. So you can also go there to just check out blogs and other interesting information on the website. So, David, thank you so much for getting up early on Saturday morning to be here and chatting with me.
Oh, it's been absolutely lovely, Karen, and thank you for the work you're doing, both with the podcast and your own writing and your professional work.
Well, as you said, I feel like we're kindred spirits in a way who've come from, we're different parts of the globe and different perspectives. And as you said, we've arrived at a very similar space. And so I'm delighted to have a chance to meet you.
Yeah, it's been lovely. Thank you very much.
All right, take care. I hope you enjoyed my interview with David Roland. I had such a good time chatting with him. And one of the things that I still feel really excited about is the study about the evolutionary view of the human brain and the three circuits through which the brain operates. The third being the caregiving drive, which evolved a little later in mammals. And I think it's really fascinating because that tends to be a drive that we can develop, but a drive that also helps us during times of stress. It helps us connect with other people, helps soothe us, and helps just alleviate some of the cost of stress when we're in difficult times. So I love knowing that there's actually a neurological basis for our caregiving, and it makes sense to me that some of us might have developed that brain circuitry at an earlier time in life and might already have it available and be using it to care for others. And other people may need to do some work on it in order to develop and expand their caregiving tendencies so that they can use that brain circuitry to help with their resilience during difficult times. So that was really exciting to me. And he talked somewhat about some of the ways that we can activate the caregiving system by sharing our experiences with other people in the form of stories, self-soothing practices like placing our hand over our heart, doing guided meditation, daily meditation, a loving kindness practice, some things that I've talked about before on this show. So anyway, it's exciting to hear that there is some studies showing the brain circuitry responsible for some of the behavior that we're able to manifest, and that we can rewire our brains. We can strengthen the circuitry in our brains also. So be sure to check out the show notes for this episode, eolupodcast.com, if you want to find links to some of the things that David and I talked about in the interview, and also links to get my new book, The Journey from Ego to Soul. If you enjoy this podcast, please do share it with other people who might benefit from listening in as well. You can also support the podcast by leaving a review on iTunes or Stitcher, iHeartRadio, wherever you happen to be listening. And if you're so inclined, you can make a small financial contribution every month on my page at Patreon, patreon.com/EOLU. And thanks to everyone who's been chipping in for the last 4 years and keeping this podcast going. So until next week, remember, we're here for love. So face your fear, be ready for whatever comes next, and love each and every moment of this amazing life. Bye-bye.